Hi guys, we're talking about boundaries and different forms of government today. Sorry, my dog is licking the couch. I'd rather him not do that. Okay, so this goes with chapter 8, key issue 3. Some of the stuff you will notice that we have already covered, like state shapes and things like that. So I'm not going to talk about those things. I'm just going to talk about a few other things that either aren't in your book or just haven't been talked about that much. So this next part is about boundaries. So something that's important to understand about boundaries is that even if they're physical boundaries like a mountain or a river, it still has been decided on that that's going to be the boundary. So boundaries are defined and demarcated and administered, meaning that they are created by people, and upholding those boundaries is also the responsibility of people, okay? Usually governing bodies, they can be marked or sometimes they're not. So just to keep in mind, the boundaries are part of political geography because that has to deal with negotiations, right? Okay, so boundaries that we maybe don't think about that often are boundaries that are in the open ocean, and like which countries claim what when it comes to the sea. So the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was developed in 1982, and it set laws for what parts of the sea are controlled by which countries. So basically, your territorial waters extend 12 nautical miles off of your coastline, okay? And a country's EEZ, or exclusive economic zone, extends 200 nautical miles from the coast. So, have a little chart here too that kind of helps. But let me go back a little bit. So 12 nautical miles is about 13.8 miles of territorial water. So let's say you're on the coast of San Francisco, 12 miles out from that coast is United States territorial waters, okay? And then 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone. So that means in that 200 miles, that country has rights for exploration, to do any kind of business with other countries. They have 200 miles of that, okay, an exclusive economic zone. The high seas is the open water, and it's beyond the limits of any country, okay? So beyond 12 miles, that's where your territorial ends. Economic waters is 200 miles. Anything beyond that doesn't really belong to anybody. Okay, so we call that the high seas. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This might be a good thing to put in your notes. Usually when you get questions about the law of the sea, it has to do with the mileage and things like that. So I would remember the numbers 12 and 200, 12 for territorial, 200 for EEZ. Okay. So, however, there can often be disputes in the law of the sea, and currently there is one going on in the South China Sea. So we're going to watch this, and I'm going to shut up for a little bit.
This is the South China Sea. It's estimated nearly a third of the world's trade passes through this body of water. It is also at the heart of a very complicated 21st century territorial dispute. A half dozen governments have competing claims over the South China Sea, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. But the biggest player here is clearly China, which has also embarked on the most aggressive campaign to claim its stake here. China's been building artificial islands in a region of reefs and partially submerged rocks known as the Spratly Islands, in some cases putting in brand new airstrips on locations like the recently constructed island of Fiery Cross. Here's what the island looked like before, and here's what it looks like after this impressive land reclamation project. And Beijing has been issuing warnings to other ships and planes to stay away from these man-made islands. It doesn't take an expert to see that the Spratly Islands are much closer to the Philippines than they are to China. So how is China laying legal claim to this territory? Well, Beijing offers up maps dating back to the early 20th century, which have since become known as the Nine-Dash Map, a map that China has even begun printing in the pages of new Chinese passports. The Philippines disputes this, citing the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It has taken China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, but China has so far refused to attend these hearings, arguing that the court has no jurisdiction in this matter. The U.S. is supporting its longtime ally, the Philippines. In the last year, U.S. warships and warplanes have conducted several so-called freedom of navigation operations, ignoring Chinese warnings and traveling close to China's man-made islands. China opposes the U.S. operations, calling them a threat to peace and stability in the region. But Beijing's actions have also alarmed many much smaller nations in the South China Sea. Critics argue that China is building the case for its territorial claims by quite literally building islands in the sea. Ivan Watson, CNN, Hong Kong.
Okay, so essentially what is happening, I wish I had a map of the Law of the Sea. I should have done that. I mean, of the South China Sea. But basically what is happening is to get the territorial waters down by the Philippines, they have created new territory for themselves, basically, by building these islands. So now they say, oh, well, 12 miles out, 200 miles out for EEZ is now ours because we have coastline here, even though it should technically be Philippine waters. So this is still an ongoing issue, pretty sneaky in my opinion of the Chinese to do that. But the law, so there is a law, but it doesn't mean that everybody always follows it. For the most part, it seems to work out pretty well, but this issue in the South China Sea is kind of troubling. Okay, so there's other types of boundaries, and they can also be physical boundaries, as I mentioned in the beginning. So a desert can be a boundary. For example, the Sahara Desert separates North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, the Andes in Argentina and Chile would be a good example of a mountain boundary. The Himalayas between East Asia and South Asia would be another boundary. So notice that these are not boundaries between countries for the most part, right? Like it's almost like a boundary that is physical is usually dividing up different regions, not so much countries. Rivers, lakes, and oceans. A good example is the Rio Grande and between U.S. and Mexico. Lake Victoria separates 3 countries in Africa, and the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the Americas. So a lot of these are not like legal boundaries, as I mentioned, but oftentimes they can break up regions and things like that. Cultural boundaries. So this first one's geometric, which is not cultural. I just have it kind of in this section. But sometimes boundaries are decided on lines of latitude and longitude, like the 38th parallel between North and South Korea that you guys learned about in that documentary. But cultural boundaries can also be religion-based. Remember, Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. Bangladesh and India are Hindu. Pakistan is Muslim, so the border was decided via religion. Language, lots of the Slavic nations in the Balkan region, once Yugoslavia broke up, were broken up due to language. Okay, so they decided, well, Czech speaks Czech, so we're going to put all the Czechs together, we're going to put all the Slovak languages together, and things like that. Okay, so we're moving on to something else here. We've talked a lot about states, and we've talked about how states, what they have in common is they all live within boundaries that are based on the same laws, right, and the same form of government. So now we should think about like what those different governments can look like. Okay? So there's two types of government we really need to focus on, and that's a federal government and a unitary government. Okay? So federal governments have a central government, but they also have smaller governments like local and, in our case, state governments, right? So the United States is a good example of a federal government. So we have a president and a Congress, and they represent the entire country. But then also we have a governor of Nevada, right? And we have Nevada state legislatures and a mayor. So power is balanced between those two groups. So we have, yes, a federal government, meaning the president, but we also have local governments. So states that break it up that way are called federal governments. So that means there's usually a form of checks and balances amongst different branches, right? There's presidents there's powers that the president has that Congress doesn't have, but then there's powers that Congress has that the president doesn't have, right? So that balance of power, meaning like all of the power of the government is not just in one person, it's checks and balances, okay? And this works a lot better if you have large states like the United States. If we only had one governing body, that would be a lot of territory and a lot of different groups of people to be over. So it works better if you have a really big state. Russia does a similar system. Canada has a prime minister, but then we talked about also their provinces have independent powers as well. And then India also organizes their state this way. The other way is a unitary government, which is a lot easier to understand. It just means that there's one central power and all of the power resides in that. So this can look different. This could be a democracy. So it could be an elected government, but it's only one body. Or it can be a dictatorship, an autocracy, or something like that, okay? But most power is held by a central government. This works better in nation states or in states that don't have a lot of cultural differences. It also works better in compact states. France is a good example. They have a parliamentary system, so that parliament holds all the power. The United Kingdom is the same way, even though they have a queen. She's kind of more of a traditional position. She doesn't actually have a lot of government power. So the power lies in the parliament. South Africa, same story. And China, all power resides in the Communist Party that has been in power ever since Mao Zedong. So again, federal power is broken up amongst lots of different governing bodies. Unitary, there's one central either person or group of people in power, and there's no breaking up of checks and balances. Okay? All right, we'll go over that one more in class because I know it's a little complicated. Okay, then capitals. Capital is a town or city that is the official seat of government in a political entity, okay? So our capital is Washington, D.C. In Nevada, it's in Carson City. Every state has a capital, a central power, okay? A forward thrust capital is a capital that is placed in a less populated area to draw migrants and development to that area. So Brazil has done this. Other countries have done this. It's when you decide that, okay, well, this area is overpopulated, or maybe we have another area that we really want to build up, but nobody lives there. Sometimes countries will decide that to move their capital to that area to get more economic advancement in that area. So that's called a forward thrust capital. It doesn't happen very often. It's really difficult to move an established capital. But yeah, so Brasilia and Brazil has done this. I forget when they did it in recent years. Okay, we also have local governing bodies that I mentioned. So these would be common things in that federal system. So there's city governments or municipal governments. Mayors, people on the city council, school districts would be an example of a local governing body, police jurisdictions, just all of these different organizations where power is broken up. Okay, so that would go with the federal system. Not to say that unitary systems don't have things like police and school districts, but they are controlled by that central governing power. Okay, all right, actually that's it. So we will go over more federal and unitary examples in class because I know that that can be really confusing. Be ready for a pop quiz as always, and have a good night.